This show is all about interviewing interesting people and learning. And from the moment I heard Dr. Ben Bikman talk, I wanted to have him on this program so that he could share his knowledge with all of you. He is a leading metabolic scientist, and he's focused on the hidden epidemic of insulin resistance. And we're going to talk a lot about that during this episode. Dr. Ben Bikman is joining me now, and I am so glad that he's here. Dr. Bikman, thanks for joining me.
My pleasure, Ellen. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah. So when you were at a dinner party or a cocktail party and someone doesn't know anything about you, but they ask you, what do you do for a living? What do you tell them?
There's two parts to the answer. One, I am just a boring professor of cell biology, but then I'm also an exciting metabolic scientist. So that means I just try to have a better understanding of the origins of things like obesity and diabetes.
What is your educational background? How did you get into this?
Certainly a bit of an evolution, but my PhD was focused on a topic called bioenergetics, which is just a complicated way of saying a lot of biochemistry and physiology, and just an effort to try to understand energy in cells. And then my postdoctoral fellowship was focused more explicitly on obesity and diabetes research with Duke Medical School.
You were at Duke, and then now you're at BYU.
That's right. Now I'm a professor in the cell biology department at BYU.
What led you to insulin resistance, and when did you start researching it and really starting to educate people about it?
At first, my interest was born from trying to understand why is it as we gain fat, we have more type 2 diabetes. At the time, as a young PhD student, my dissertation was just trying to focus on some of the connection between obesity and diabetes. And that was a focus that continued through my fellowship and even my first years of being an independent researcher and professor on my own. But over time, and what really led me to start wanting to share this message outside of just the traditional realm of academia, was my awareness of the fact that insulin resistance is in fact a causal problem or a foundational problem with all of these plagues of prosperity, all of these diseases of civilization that were once unheard of, things like heart disease and Alzheimer's disease, type 2 diabetes, the metabolic origins of infertility, high blood pressure. These are all modern problems. And while we think of them as being unrelated to each other, they all share a common core, namely this little known problem called insulin resistance.
When I heard you speak, and I felt like I'm a visual person, and I think a lot of people in the communications business are, who don't have a science background. I thought that this was the best way to describe it, and I feel like this would really help our audience. But you described insulin resistance as being a tree, like the trunk of a tree. So I kind of wrote this out. This is insulin resistance here, and this is the trunk. And then you have, heart disease, infertility, type 2 diabetes, liver disease, stroke, erectile dysfunction, Alzheimer's, PCOS. I mean, all of these really awful things that you don't want to have, especially if you want to live a healthy life. And I felt like this was such a great visualization for what you are educating people about.
Yeah, well, you get full marks on your illustration skills at presenting that figure. Yeah, I actually really like that analogy because it is kind of like a tree where I would argue that our conventional clinical view of chronic disease has us only focusing on the branches. And because of this, our approach to these problems is akin to us just trimming the branch, only for it to just to stubbornly grow back. In other words, we're never really solving the problem. That our modern approach to, say, hypertension and to fatty liver disease would be to take two separate medications or multiple medications, trying to treat them as if they were unrelated. And yet my hope is to share the information that indicates that they are, as you showed, they are all just branching off of the same thing, that rather than continuing to put all of this time and money into treating them as distinct problems and never actually addressing the root cause. Let's just go right to the roots because they do share a common origin. So let's just cut the tree down rather than continue to trim at the branches.
I think a lot of people know that insulin is tied to diabetes, especially if you know someone who does have like type 1 diabetes, but just educate folks about what is insulin and why is it important? Why is it so vital to our body?
Insulin is, of course, a hormone that is flowing through our blood unless you have type 1 diabetes. And the unique problem with type 1 diabetes is that the person's autoimmune disease has destroyed their beta cells of the pancreas. Those are the small little cells that make insulin. But for all of its humility and being so petite in size, insulin has an outsized effect on the body. It is one of the few hormones that will literally affect every single cell of the body. Now, I know kids these days like to use the word literally a bit too liberally for an old guy like me. So rest assured, I'm using it very carefully. Literally, every single cell of the body will respond to insulin, from brain cells to bone cells, from lung cells to liver cells, and every cell in between. Insulin will tell it to do something. But that's another mission of mine as an educator, that I have wanted to help people separate insulin from just blood sugar or blood glucose. Most people, even highly educated people, have a hard time imagining that insulin would have a life or a relevance outside of blood glucose. But that view, that glucose-centric view, is one of the reasons we detect problems like type 2 diabetes so much later than we could. What type 2 diabetes has in common with all of the other problems that we've already mentioned is the high insulin levels. That's the marker we should be focusing on the most. So if I could wave my magic wand and change some aspect of clinical practice, it would be first and foremost that we actually started looking at insulin, because again, it influences every single cell of the body. And what it does varies on the cell type, but suffice it to say, if things start to go wrong, then you have the potential of things starting to go wrong in every part of the body because insulin affects all of them.
If those cells become insulin resistant, then disease spreads.
Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah, so for example, when the blood vessels become insulin resistant, now you are contributing to hypertension. When certain cortexes or certain regions of the brain become insulin resistant, now you're manifesting with perhaps Alzheimer's disease, or in different people, it may manifest as a migraine. You see similar things in, say, the ovaries of a woman. In insulin resistance, now her ovaries are not producing enough estrogens to facilitate a normal ovulatory cycle, and it manifests as the most common form of infertility in women, namely polycystic ovary syndrome. And we could continue to go. I could go almost organ by organ and list how insulin resistance makes that tissue suffer, and then the diseases that come along with it.
When you first started talking about this and kind of waving your flag and saying this is a problem, what was the response within the medical community? Was there doubt?
I certainly have found over the years that I've tried a few different approaches, but just to help people appreciate why a PhD scientist is even stepping into this realm at all, as much as I love being a professor and a scientist, and I do deeply, I also somewhat push against the inherent boundaries that seem to come along with science, where we as scientists are often too content to just publish our findings in a peer-reviewed science journal that no one will ever read. And even if they read it, it's such a technical jargon that they probably wouldn't really understand it. And so when I began wanting to try to test the waters and see whether these ideas could have a life outside of the ivory tower of academia, it started with local clinical entities, to answer your question. And I found that if I approached the subject by showing the statistics with regards to metabolic health, and then I would help them understand that metabolic health is simply another term for insulin resistance, and then showing how insulin resistance is causing diseases by just sort of overwhelming them with some peer-reviewed data. The medical community has overwhelmingly appreciated it. And indeed, it's the audience that I enjoy speaking to the most, because I revel in the idea of medicine being practiced in such a way where you have people like biomedical scientists who get paid to ask questions. That's what a scientist does. But the answer to that question is only relevant if it can be applied. And so that information needs to be shared from the biomedical scientist with the clinical person who gets paid to see patients. And that is when the idea can come to life. So by and large, I've been quite delighted with how the message has been received. But again, I have found over the years that there's a better way of kind of bringing it up. And indeed, as a final comment, I've found that one of the best ways is to not start with insulin resistance, because too many people, even clinicians, will hear the word insulin and then immediately assume that the conversation is only going to be relevant to diabetes.
Dr. Jeremy London, a cardiac surgeon, I just interviewed him a week ago, and he mentioned it kind of in passing. So clearly the message is getting out there, and he's talking about it. I read a headline that said, regaining control of your insulin levels, you can regain control of your life. How do you start to do that?
That's a great sentiment, and it's absolutely true. I endorse it completely.
You know, one question I wanted to interrupt too, though. I guess we need to know, what is your baseline? How do you know that your insulin levels are too high? I guess that's where we should probably start. Unfortunately,
most people won't know, because it is a clinical marker that is the elephant in the room, and we continue to just step around it out of ignorance or malice, I'm not sure what. But if someone is able to get their insulin levels measured at their next clinical appointment, or they can indeed go look at their last one, if your insulin level is somewhere below 10 microunits per mil, that's a good sign. You're doing well. It's evidence generally that you are insulin sensitive. If it's in the teens, that's a bit of a warning that maybe you've got a problem. And if it's high teens into 20s, that's a red alert. You need to turn the ship around. And just to help people appreciate this, you and I have been talking about how insulin resistance is so relevant given its connection to these chronic diseases, but it is the most prevalent disease worldwide. And I've given versions of my message and talks throughout Southeast Asia and East Asia and the Middle East. In fact, in those distinct regions, the problem is even worse there than it is here.
Wow.
It's a uniquely American thing to think we're the fattest and most diabetic, and we're actually neither of those. So this is a global message, and it's largely driven by our chronic consumption of refined carbohydrates. We have a global diet that consists almost completely of eating foods from bags and boxes with barcodes, and 70% of all calories consumed globally come from carbohydrates, and that is what spikes insulin the most. And so with that idea in mind, the solution starts to become apparent, where if we have a constant carbohydrate consumption culture, then the solution is there, which is control carbohydrates. I know you are a proponent of the ketogenic diet, which is going to focus a little bit more on fats and protein and less carbs. Worldwide, though, more people are going to be eating rice and beans, correct? So what's interesting is a lot of people will mention rice, for example, and they'll say, well, Asians eat rice and they're not obese like Americans. That's a very interesting nuance, actually, where one of the reasons I did my postdoctoral fellowship with Duke University was actually because they have a satellite campus located in the beautiful Southeast Asian country of Singapore, where the rates of type 2 diabetes, which again is insulin resistance that's just gone so far that you can't control the blood sugar levels anymore. The rates of type 2 diabetes there are higher than they are here in the United States. So these countries that we would point to, like Japan, most people would point to Japan and say, well, they're not obese like us.
Right.
That's true, but their rates of diabetes are about as high as ours are. And so the consumption of these refined carbohydrates, and grains qualify, rice included, are what's largely driving the blood glucose levels to go high all the time. And as blood glucose levels go high, insulin will go high as well, because one of its effects will be to lower blood glucose. But the more we continue to eat those carbohydrates, and we eat them so often. And that's a bit more of a uniquely kind of Western thing, that we eat 5 or 6 times a day, or we're drinking those the sugar as well. Then we are spending every waking moment in a state of elevated insulin, and that is the main driver of insulin resistance. So we just have to give our bodies a break from the incessant insulin. And the key there then is just control carbs. And just one additional comment there, I've never wanted to be an advocate of a ketogenic diet, although I have no problem with it. What I want to be seen as, if anything, is a defender of ketones.
Okay.
Because there's so much misinformation around them. My lab has published multiple papers on ketones showing that they act as a signal to help defend muscle from injury. They also help to improve brain function, which is probably the hottest area of research, is looking at the degree to which ketones are an optimal fuel for the brain in instances or disorders like migraines and Alzheimer's disease, where people can, for example, be in ketosis and never have another migraine again for the rest of their lives. So I defend ketones, but I don't necessarily ever mean to be seen as a drum-pounding advocate that that's the one approach for everyone. What I do say is what everyone ought to do is be more mindful of the carbohydrates that they're eating and focus on those that are going to spike blood glucose a little less.
Yeah, and there has been, I mean, in recent years, a push to eat 6 meals a day, and you're saying that that is going to basically leave your body in a state of elevated insulin, because your body is exactly constantly having to burn it.
Yes, the fact that we consume carbohydrates so overwhelmingly, and we're eating it 5 or 6 times a day, that means that because insulin is elevated, that's not only driving insulin resistance, but what I think is very interesting is that the body is a hybrid, metabolically speaking, and that at any moment, our body is primarily relying on one of 2 fuels, namely it's burning fats or it's burning glucose or sugar burning. Insulin is the signal that determines which fuel is being used. So if your insulin is constantly elevated, good luck losing fat, because you're not ever allowing your body to go into fat burning mode. As long as insulin is elevated, you are burning sugar.
What about women? Because I know, especially for women who are maybe, menopausal, there has been discussion that maybe they should be eating those smaller meals throughout the day. Has there been any research about that?
I'm unaware of any clinical studies that have looked at meal frequency in menopause, but as a scientist who studies metabolism and endocrinology, one of the classes I teach is a graduate course in hormone studies or hormone science. I would reject that idea. I think menopause is no doubt a remarkable shift in myriad health-related outcomes because of the loss of estrogens. Foremost among them is changes in metabolism. It's the high estrogens that allow a woman to kind of be metabolically bulletproof pre-menopausal. Her risk of dying from any of these chronic diseases is so much fantastically lower than her male counterparts as to be laughable. But as her estrogens come down, as they do with menopause, she becomes immortal, metabolically speaking, and is now subject to all of the same problems her male counterparts have been, his entire life. But I do not think it would be prudent for a woman going through menopause to start to eat multiple meals. Indeed, I think that would be the worst time to do it, because now, as her estrogens come down, she starts to store her fat, albeit subtly, in a way that her male counterpart does, which is going to be a relative increase in visceral or central fat storage with a relatively, but even if it's modest, a reduction in the fat stored beneath the skin. That's called subcutaneous, mostly in a gal, that's going to be on her buttocks and her hips. That's a very healthy place to store fat. And it's estrogens that decide where that fat is going to be stored. So again, very clearly, I think during menopause and postmenopause, that would be the worst time to start eating multiple smaller meals. And I'm unaware of any science that would suggest that would be a benefit.
Does the quality of protein, meat, in your opinion, does that matter if you are eating more of a kind of keto, more of a protein high diet.
Yeah. Now, again, Ellen, I don't mean to be seen as the keto guy.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah. So insofar as, in my mind, rule number one for preventing or reversing insulin resistance is control carbs. Just to make that very clear.
Okay.
Stop eating carbs from bags and boxes with barcodes. Focus more on whole fruits and vegetables. Eat them, don't drink them. That's the solution. You want those carbs to come with fiber. So focus on fiber as a part of that rule.
And you can also talk Mediterranean diet too.
That's right. Yeah, and I have no problem with that. Now, for me, the second rule is almost as important as the first, which is prioritize protein. And it is indelicate to say, but as a scientist, I don't have to be bothered by cultural trends or norms. As a biomedical scientist, I can state this with an absolute exclamation mark. Animal protein is a superior source of protein and nutrition overall than any plant protein on the planet. Now, I don't mean to say that people can't or shouldn't eat plant protein, but I also would want them to know that it is, by every metric, not as effective at servicing the human needs as the animal protein. And a paper was just published in early 2025 that found that as we age, the need for animal protein goes up. That there's a phenomenon known as anabolic resistance, where the human body becomes slightly less capable at converting dietary protein into the protein that makes up the substance of our bodies, the protein of our muscle and bones, for example. We need more protein as we get older, and we need better protein. And so when we're young, maybe we can get away with that inferior protein from plants a little better. But as we get older, the evidence is now quite clear and definitive. We can't mess around. We have to focus on the superior protein. And as unpopular as it may be, that's coming from animal-sourced foods.
Wow. Let's say that in your family, you have Alzheimer's that runs in your family, and it's a train that you can't stop. It's coming for you. Have you found that there are things you can do that can lower your insulin resistance that might potentially help you, even if Alzheimer's runs in your family?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I want to give it the appropriate gravity, because Alzheimer's is such a scary problem. Yeah. It is terrifying. It's really interesting to note how the conversation has been shifting around Alzheimer's disease over the past 5 to 10 years. This was once perceived as a disease of these plaques that accumulate in the brain, and these plaques disrupt the function of neurons, and then that manifests as Alzheimer's disease. However, that whole idea is just being blown apart. And indeed, from its very origins, it appears that the very first publications that supported that view were based on falsified data. It potentially is nothing but a house of cards. Now, regardless of its origins, walking somewhat silently behind the scenes has been the metabolic view that Alzheimer's disease is simply another problem of metabolism in the brain. And this evidence is, not only has it existed for decades, it is growing almost explosively currently. Perhaps because of the death of the plaque-based theory, people have been more desperate to focus on this one. But a paper was published out of Sweden, which is very famous worldwide for having very rigorous documentation of its citizens, and they found 8 variables that predicted Alzheimer's disease as they looked backwards in time at these individuals. And they found that 5 of the 8 variables that were predictive of who was going to get Alzheimer's disease were related to glucose and insulin resistance, glucose handling and insulin levels and stuff. So it's extraordinarily relevant. My comment then is, if someone is looking at their family history and feeling somewhat doomed because of seeing family members with both Alzheimer's disease and type 2 diabetes, the most obvious form of manifestation of insulin resistance, this is where I unapologetically say ketones are your best friend. Ketones, that area, within the entire realm of ketone-related research, the largest, fastest moving area is Alzheimer's disease, followed closely by cancer, mind you, but Alzheimer's research is continuing to show remarkable benefits, even in real time, where you take someone with Alzheimer's disease, have them perform cognitive tests, and then have them drink a ketone supplement or otherwise get into ketosis, and have them repeat those tests, and they're immediately performing better. Not that you've cured the problem, but the fact that you see an improvement, to me, does suggest that that might be a therapy in order to help push off the risk of Alzheimer's disease from settling in the first place. So among all of the disorders where I believe ketones are the most relevant, it would be Alzheimer's disease.
Wow, that's fascinating. I wanted to ask you if life in general, when you talk about having fun, socializing, maybe drinking some alcohol, maybe you smoke, maybe you vape, what is your stance on some of those life habits?
Yeah. Now, of course, you're speaking to a Mormon boy here, so those aren't vices that I imbibe in, although I have my own, I suppose. But yeah, that's just a funny little aside. Here we are in the Mountain West, but where this conversation takes on a funny little turn here. But yeah, those, insofar as I focus on my strengths, which is the metabolic realm, people may be surprised to know that there is in fact metabolic consequence to this. Alcohol is a driver of metabolic dysfunction, independent of its effects on the liver. And by the way, when the liver starts to fail, good luck maintaining optimal metabolic health or anything else. It's so important. But very often, the consumption of the alcohol is going to be coming with a substantial sugar load. And that's a problem because when you drink alcohol with all those sugars, the alcohol must be burned first. It demands, if you will, kind of priority boarding onto the metabolic bus. And so all those sugars just stick around. And so you can have a substantial increase in blood glucose levels, which of course will give rise to a subsequent increase in blood insulin. And then with regards to cigarette smoking and vaping, vaping is definitely the newer area of research. My lab, in collaboration with some colleagues, we have published now several papers, and others have as well, finding that cigarette smoke exposure is a rapid cause of insulin resistance. Now, the only reason you don't see much of the consequences of that in a smoker is because the smoking is driving them to not eat very much,
right,
even though they are developing insulin resistance. The problem with vaping appears to actually be just as bad, where our early evidence, and we just received an NIH-funded grant to pursue this question, so I'll have more answers to this in the next couple of years, but our early evidence suggests that the hyperheated and thus kind of adulterated molecules of vaping are just as capable at causing inflammation, and then the inflammation is actually what appears to be driving the insulin resistance, because inflammation is actually its own cause of insulin resistance. But in the case of inhaling these harmful particles, again, whether it's traditional cigarette smoke or vaping, the end result, at least from a metabolic perspective, appears to be the same.
And sleep is critical too, for everything.
Oh, yes, my gosh, yeah. So, in fact, you're allowing me now, Ellen, we've now covered, as I answered this question, all three of the primary drivers of insulin resistance. I focused most of the time on how high insulin causes insulin resistance because of what we eat. Another cause is inflammation, and that's driven in part by what we may be breathing in. And now the last of the three primary causes is stress. Now, again, I confessed a moment ago that I'm a professor who teaches a graduate course in endocrinology or hormones. I consider stress to be a problem of the stress hormones, namely cortisol and epinephrine, cortisol and epinephrine. Those hormones both want to push up blood glucose levels as high and quickly as possible. And then it's no surprise that they both cause insulin resistance very quickly. Now, what does that have to do with sleep? It's because if you get a bad night of sleep, your cortisol levels are going to be significantly elevated the following day, and that is the primary driver of poor sleep-induced insulin resistance. So whether it's high insulin, whether it is inflammation, whether it is stress, all of this touches on the fact that our habits, how we live our lives, is the culprit or the cure Unfortunately, in most instances, it's what's driving insulin resistance. But the good news in the midst of this scary, sobering story is that it can also be the solution. That as we change these things around, we don't have to rely on medications and all of their side effects. We can, for the most part, go through the somewhat uncomfortable process of changing our habits.
Well, and I think, too, just personally, as I have gotten older, I'm in my mid-40s now, you notice things about yourself. You're so much more, I am anyway, more in tune with, okay, I've had a couple glasses of wine. You respond completely differently in your 40s than you did when you were in your 20s, you know, the next day or whatever. And I think you are so much more conscious of those decisions that you have made. And you don't really want to feel like that, frankly. You just don't. It's a completely different, and you realize too, I think, you know, at that point in your life that you want to live a good life. And if you have children and if you want to continue to live that good life and be active, you know, maybe prioritize lifting weights and, you know, doing the things that I think that you know that will continue to help you live a good life. So I just think that having the knowledge but I think honestly just feeling the way your body feels and knowing your body can help you make better decisions as you get older.
I completely agree. I would just add a hearty amen to everything you just said. The older you get, the more you're able to look at the indulgence and then remember the consequences a little more acutely than when you're younger. Yeah. When you're younger, you're you're incapable of seeing the next day, if you will, quote unquote. You're incapable or less capable of appreciating the downside of what you're about to do, and rather just overwhelmed with the instant gratification of what you're about to do. Yeah, it's definitely one of the perks of aging. I've certainly found with my own indulgences, staying up later, eating a bunch of ice cream or some cereal, and cereal is my particular weakness. And I found that it's not worth it. That St. Augustine has what I consider to be one of the most brilliant quotes that is relevant to this. He didn't intend it to be used in this specific context, I don't think, but he said, abstinence is easier than perfect moderation. And that is so brilliant to me because it, in my mind, it allows me to define myself a bit differently than maybe someone else might, which is when it comes to certain habits, like, for example, a bowl of cereal, as silly as that is something I cannot moderate. I'm an addict. And so if I indulge even the littlest bit, I won't stop until I have cereal coming out my nose, as indelicate as that is to say. So one of the reasons why, indeed, that is one of the reasons why I rail against the mantra of moderation in all things. That is spoken in such reverent tones, as if the person who's stating them is so clever, and yet I believe it is ignorant or overlooks human nature, which is the tendency to become addicted in certain habits, in certain ways. And when it comes back to nutrition, among the three macronutrients, carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, unfortunately, humans have only ever shown addictive tendencies towards one of them. And indeed, we see that manifested globally. It's the one that we're eating the most of. No one is sitting around on a Saturday night craving a plate of bacon and eggs. It doesn't happen. If only it did. No one's craving protein and fat. We crave something sweet and gooey or salty and crunchy. And speaking of sleep, of all the times of the day to spike your blood glucose and get into this hyperglycemic state, doing so before bedtime has got to be the worst possible time. I know that's a tangent, but going to bed with elevated blood sugar levels actually activates your sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight response. And you lay there trying to fall asleep, wondering why you're so hot, why your heart is beating so hard and so fast. You're not anxious about anything. You just have metabolically wrecked your sleep. And so good luck calming down.
Well, hey, don't get me wrong. I know you're Mormon, but you know I love glasses of wine. They're great. But again, as you get older, you know, I mean, you're not stupid. Yeah,
you just appreciate the consequences a little more.
Yeah, absolutely. When you look at someone just in the mirror, someone can be skinny, but not healthy on the inside, correct?
Oh, yeah. In fact, this allows me to come back to the phenomenon in Asia, in Southeast Asia and East Asia, even South Asia or India. There's a remarkable spectrum when it comes to which ethnicities can hold their fat better. And on one end of that spectrum is those who have the lowest kind of ability to gain fat in a healthy way, and that's going to be like East and Southeast Asians. And then as you go to the other end of the spectrum, where you'd have whites and blacks, those are ethnicities that can gain more fat, but yet keep the metabolic consequences of that fat at bay. And that is a different origin of insulin resistance, where the three primary causes of insulin resistance that I mentioned earlier that you led me through very elegantly, those are very fast causes and fast turnarounds. But when fat cells get big, they start to promote their own form of insulin resistance. But one very brief point of clarification, certain ethnicities have the ability to make new fat cells, like whites and blacks. So if you take a white guy and compare him to his East Asian counterparts, so you have a white American and you have a Japanese fellow, also American, let's say, but just a white dude and a Japanese guy, and they're college roommates, and they get back together 10 years later, and they've both gained 20 pounds of fat. In fact, we wouldn't even need to go that far, but let's just stick with it. 20 pounds isn't that much over 10 years, but they're both equally chubbier than they were before. The Caucasian, the white guy, has made new fat cells over at least a part of that fat gain. And that means his fat cells are all a little smaller than they would otherwise be because there are more of them to carry the metabolic burden. But that same amount of fat now on his old best pal Japanese buddy, the East Asian guy, he wasn't able to make new fat cells. So that 20 pounds of fat went right into his existing fat cells, which means all of them are much bigger. And fat cells are much more favorable to promoting insulin resistance than smaller fat cells. So size matters most when it comes to understanding why fat matters. It's not the mass of fat that matters most. It's the size of the fat cells that end up determining whether that fat is problematic or not. The white guy or the black guy is just a little chubbier and he doesn't look as good in his Speedo, but then the East Asian or the Southeast Asian, they're just as chubby perhaps, but now they have fatty liver disease, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and more.
Wow. And then if you go to the doctor, they're going to give you a bunch of pills to change it.
It will never solve the problem. It will just mask the symptoms.
Correct. That is not the solution. You have some books that you have written, and I think that they're great if people want to learn a little bit more. Can you tell folks what they are?
Yes, thanks so much. Yeah, I have them strategically placed so everyone can see them over my shoulder. I have two books. The first one was entitled Why We Get Sick, and that was my first book, and indeed really my main effort to try to just share this message of what I considered was a totally overlooked problem. Again, insulin resistance. So that's kind of the go-to book to understand what insulin resistance is, where it comes from, and why it matters. In other words, how does it connect to disease? And then I did another book published last year called How Not to Get Sick, and that's more of another kind of review of the fat cell specifically, actually, much more focus on the fat cell and its origins in insulin resistance, and then solutions, heavy focus on various protocols and strategies to help prevent or reverse insulin resistance.
Dr. Bikman, we could continue to talk a lot more, I know, but thank you so much. And again, I think that the tree is just a great kind of visualization for our audience, and I hope that more people will learn more about insulin resistance, talk to their doctor. And there was another headline that I didn't even get to, but it said that by, I think it was 2050, that like half of the world population is expected to be obese. And you know, we need to get that under control. And again, we're not just talking about America, we are talking about the world, and we need to be healthier. Ozempic is not going to solve it. Pills are not going to solve it. and we need to get it under control. So Dr. Bikman, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate your time. Really fascinating stuff.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks. Really, nothing thrills a professor more than having a new bunch of students to teach new ideas to. So I'm thrilled to have been able to share some of these thoughts.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thanks for watching this episode of The Curious Bee with Ellen McNamara. More episodes on Fox Local.